Okay, so kind of reviewing what we know about congruent polygons in general, but congruent triangles specifically. So if I tell you that two triangles are congruent, what does that mean? Like, what does it mean if I say that these triangles are congruent? So I'm going to draw a picture here. Tell me what that means, that the triangles are congruent. So this is PQT. And this is triangle WXM. So when I draw the picture, how do I know where to put W? Kendall, how do I know where to put W?
The W goes where the P is.
Right, and then where it is?
Because they're congruent, so they equal each other.
Okay, so that's what congruent means, right? If they're in the same spot, then they should have the same measure. They should have the same length or the same angle measure, right? So what is the meaning of the triangles being congruent? It means that all corresponding sides and angles are congruent. Oh, yay. They're doing construction here as well. I thought they were done with our side of the building. Apparently not quite. I think they're working on a student entrance, but I'm just hearing it from the corner there. Okay, so list the pairs. Ryan, give me the pairs of angles that are congruent. Ryan.
So,
hi.
Okay, PQT. Oh no, that's already up there. Wait, can you repeat the question?
Yeah, just tell me which angles correspond. We want to list the pairs of congruent angles. Tell me the angles that correspond.
Would it just be like P is equal to W?
Okay, so
be like that.
P is congruent to angle.
Oh yeah, congruent to W. And then T, I think it's M. I can't really see it up there.
Okay, look at this statement.
Yeah, T and M.
Right?
Yeah. And then P and and then Q and X.
And then Q, angle Q is congruent to angle X, right? So yeah, I drew a picture just so we could look at that and go, okay, so we would know that these angles, P would match with W, they'd be congruent, and Q and X would be congruent, and T and M would be congruent. Okay, but you can also get that from the, what is this thing called? Oops, sorry. What is this thing called when you write the triangles are congruent? What is that called?
That's a congruent statement.
That's a congruent statement, right? Okay, so from the congruent statement, you can get the congruent angles and also the congruent sides. So Lily, tell me what the congruent segments are.
Would it be PQ angle? Segment PQ is congruent to segment WX.
Right. And remember, the order matters. So if you said segment PQ and segment XW, it wouldn't quite be right. Okay, then what?
QT and XM.
Okay, and again, you can get it from the congruent statement here. She says QT, then it should go XM. All right, and then the last pair, Braden, what's the last pair?
TP and MW.
Segment TP is congruent to segment MW. Okay, so he went from T to P, and so from M to W. And again, it doesn't matter if the first one, you could call that PT, as long as you call the second one WM. There's nothing magical about the first segment that you name. Just make sure the second one matches the first one. Good. Okay, so that's what it means for polygons in general to be congruent, but of course triangles. So if I gave you this congruent statement here, then it says angle P is congruent to angle W by, the reason that you know that those are congruent is because the meaning of the word congruence is that everything matches up to be the same. So it's the meaning of the word, that means it's the definition. Okay, the reason that we know that all those parts have to be the same is because that's what it means for triangles to be congruent. It's the meaning of the word, which is the definition. So you'll see that sometimes in problems, if you know that the triangles are congruent, then you can use, all right, because they're congruent, the meaning of congruent triangles is that all the corresponding sides and all the corresponding angles are congruent. Sometimes you'll see the phrase, instead of writing definition of congruent triangles, you might see the phrase corresponding parts of congruent triangles, I'll zoom back out in a second, are congruent. Okay, the kind of actual definition of congruent triangles is that corresponding angles and sides or parts of congruent triangles are congruent. Now, the way that I would like you to abbreviate it, you can say corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. Now, this is important. Sometimes you might have a tutor, or you might see in the book, or another teacher maybe might use the abbreviation CPCTC. That's supposed to stand for corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. However, that is kind of a mouthful, and so we tend to end up like not really knowing what that means if we always write CPCTC. So I really don't want you to use that abbreviation. Again, if you look up answers in the book, sometimes they might write that, or a tutor might write that. What I would like you to write is either definition of congruent triangles. These are what I will accept from you. Either definition of congruent triangles or corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent, abbreviated this way. Okay. So you'll see how this works in a minute. We're going to be focusing on proofs, and you want to not get freaked out that we're doing proofs. The proofs are really the same thing as what we were doing when we're determining if triangles are congruent. It's just that we're writing down the reasons as we go. Okay, so the first problem says segment BA is congruent to segment DA. If that was not marked on the picture, the first thing I would want you to do is mark it on the picture. Okay, sometimes, unfortunately, they will mark it for you already, and then you have to make sure that you're paying attention to that was a given, that you also write it down in the proof. Okay, so that was a given. Our other given is segment CA is congruent to segment EA, so that's second step is also given. So segment CA and segment EA, if you had not already had that marked in the picture, it's important that you would then mark it as well. Okay, angle CAB is congruent to angle EAD. Colleen, can you tell me what that is?
Sorry, I just spilled my water everywhere, so I'm cleaning that up. Can you say that again?
Why?
Like, what do I need to do?
How do you know those angles are?
What?
How do you know those angles are congruent? Angle CA.
Because they're reflective.
Reflective would be if I said angle CAB is congruent to angle CAB. I understand what you're thinking reflective, but that's not actually reflexive. What is it when you have two angles that are congruent because they're like that? Do you want me to call them?
Yeah.
It starts with a
GeomA.
D. Not sure. Okay. Lily, can you help her?
No.
Did you say me?
Yeah.
Oh, vertical angles are congruent.
Vertical angles are congruent. So you will write this statement here, and then you'll justify it over here. It's the same thought process that you had to go through when you were deciding if those triangles were congruent. It's just that you're going to now justify it, you know, kind of write down the reasons as you go. Okay. Maggie, why are the triangles congruent?
They're congruent by side, angle, side.
Side, angle, side. So when it says the triangles are congruent, the reason is going to have to be one of those shortcuts. Okay, every time that in the proof your statement is triangles are congruent, it's going to be side, 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 or side, angle, side, or side, angle, or angle, side, or hypotenuse, leg. Okay, every time you have congruent triangles there, their reason is going to be one of those shortcut methods. Now, the other thing you need to be careful about is when you think you're ready to say the triangles are congruent, you need to make sure that everything that you're using has already been stated in the proof and is also marked on the picture. Okay, so we used 2 pairs of sides and a pair of angles. If you're telling me that it's side, angle, side, I have to be able to see the parts that you're using. Okay, and then I should also see on the picture how it's side, angle, side. Those are 2 things I'm going to be looking for when you're doing these proofs, is that, you know, generally I'm going to give you the steps over here, but sometimes it might be some things on each side. So if not everything is given, you have to kind of make sure that you understand that all the parts have to be listed before you say the triangles are congruent. Now, they didn't actually ask us to prove that the triangles were congruent. They asked us to prove that angle C is congruent to angle E. How would we know that these angles have to be the same? How do we know that angle C has to be congruent to angle E?
Is it because they're corresponding?
Yes, they're in the corresponding places. And what do you know about the triangles?
They're congruent.
They're congruent. So what are we going to write? We're going to write one of these reasons, right? You said that triangles are congruent. Therefore, what it means to be congruent is that all the pieces that are in the same place are congruent. So you either write definition of congruent triangles, or, and you don't have to write both, either one is sufficient, whichever one you like, or corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent.
I have a question.
Yes.
So could we write either for any time? Or does it matter if it's definition of triangles or corresponding parts?
It really doesn't matter. Either is fine. Make sure that you're your definition of congruent triangles, or else you're saying corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. But you don't have to write both, and either one is fine. There's not really like, well, in this situation, this is better, and this, I mean, no. Just, you should kind of know that they're the same, because if you're doing a proof and I write, like if I give you this as the reason, you should understand that that means that previously you would have had to have proven the triangle's congruent. Okay, so that's an important idea when we're doing these proofs. Sometimes they will ask you to prove triangles congruent, in which case your last step is going to be the triangles are congruent and the reason has to be side, 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 or side, angle, side, one of those shortcuts. Okay, but a lot of times they'll say, all right, after you prove the triangle's congruent, then find all the parts that match up. So for example, angle C and angle E are congruent. So when you're looking at these proofs, the structure of it is going to be, let's list all the segments and angles that we need to make the triangles congruent. And then because the triangles are congruent, that means that we can list all the angles or sides as being congruent. So this right here, you know, up until the second to last step, you're just kind of figuring out why the triangles are congruent. And then your last step, and this is how they almost always go. These proofs almost always go. The second to last step is the congruent triangles. The reason has to be one of those shortcut methods. And then the last step is going to be, because those segments, because those triangles are congruent, the corresponding angles or segments or whatever are congruent. Okay, they're in the same position. The 2 triangles are congruent, therefore those angles are congruent. But almost always these proofs will have the second to last step being congruent triangles and the last step being either a pair of angles or segments are congruent by definition of congruent triangles. All right, so let's look at the second one. Okay, complete the following proof. Now, as you kind of write all the congruent stuff down, you want to make sure you're marking it on the picture. So we have angle 2 is congruent to angle 1. That is given. Where is the other given? Angle 2 is congruent to angle 1 is given.
Number 4.
Number 4. Okay, so at the beginning, if we kind of write the givens, identify where the givens are, then we won't forget about it later. There was a problem, there was a proof like this on the last, I think it was a quiz that the honor students took. And because the given was not together at the top, some people were not noticing that it was just a given and they were trying to come up with other reasons. So that should be easy as long as you pay attention to all the givens. Okay, so angle 1 is congruent to angle 2, and then we have angle 4 congruent to angle 5. Those are given pieces of information. Okay, angle 1 congruent to angle 3. Let's see, how about max? Why are angle 1 and 3 congruent?
It's not because of vertical angles, right?
Yes, it is. Yeah, 1 and 3 are
Oh, it
vertical.
is because of.
There's your 2 lines.
Oh, 1 and 3. I thought you said 1 and 2.
1 and 3.
Okay, yeah, 1 and 3 are vertical angles.
So what do I write?
Would you put vertical angles are congruent?
Right, good. Okay, so 2 congruent to 3. Where is that coming from? So we have 1 congruent to 2, 1 congruent to 3. How would you know that 2 is congruent to 3? What's the reason for step 3?
Is it transitive property of the congruence?
It's transitive. Good. Was that Kara?
Yeah.
I need to have like 5 monitors and be able to have everything up in different places, but okay, so transitive, right. So how does transitive work, Kara?
I'm trying to think of how to word it. Like if thing 1 is congruent to thing 2, and thing 2 is congruent to thing 3, then thing 1 is congruent to thing 3.
So thing 1 is congruent to thing 2, and thing 2 is congruent to thing 3. Then thing 1 is congruent to thing 3. So the way that it's written there, if we kind of try to link from the left side to the right side, we would go angle 2 is congruent to angle 1. Angle 1 is congruent to angle 3. Therefore, angle 2 is congruent to angle 3. Okay, transitive property, and again, make sure that says of congruence. Okay, so angle 2 is congruent to angle 3 is like we've kind of already used these 2 steps now. And then we have these 2 steps that we haven't used yet. Now I'm going to look ahead a little bit. What we're trying to prove were congruent segments. BC and DC. BC is here and DC is here. So if we prove the triangle's congruent, then those will be corresponding parts. So if you just look at the picture here, look at those 2 triangles. What would we need to know in order to make the triangles congruent? Because right now we only have 2 pairs of angles.
We need another side to make it like angle side of angle.
Okay, so do we have any other sides that we could say are congruent?
Yeah, AC is reflexive.
Reflexive, good. So, don't get intimidated by the fact that this is in proof form. It's the same exact thing that we were doing before when I would be like, here's, the triangles, what pieces do we know? And we could mark that congruent by reflexive. So yes, segment AC is congruent to segment AC. And the reason that you know that should be the next step is because we're trying to prove the triangle's congruent. And remember, I told you that you have to have all the parts named. So we have to be able to check off, okay, we have a pair of angles, a pair of angles, and a pair of sides. So in order to prove the triangle's congruent, we have to have those 3 pieces of information. Okay, Gabe, why are the triangles congruent? And this reason was reflexive property of congruence. Gabriel, why are the triangles congruent?
Can I answer it?
What's the reason? It looks like a fish. How do you know the triangles are congruent?
ASA
Angle side,
congruence.
ASA congruence. Now again, remember that I kind of pointed out the structure is going to be figure out the stuff that you need to say the triangles are congruent, which is what we have here. And then your second to last step is almost always the triangles are congruent and the reason needs to be one of these shortcuts. Okay, and then your last step, how do we know that those blue segments are congruent? That's what we're trying to prove. So our last step is the proof statement. Segment BC is congruent to segment DC. Blair, what will the reason be?
Definition congruent triangles.
Yeah, good. Definition of congruent triangles. Now again, you can either write definition of congruent triangles, which I think is shorter. I think that's easier. But you can write that, or if you prefer to write corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. That's just saying that because all of the, because the triangles are congruent, all the parts are congruent. Good. Okay, so this is what I said on those last two proofs. So just to kind of like make sure that that's sunk in. Prove the triangle's congruent, and then your last step is going to be definition of congruent triangles or corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. Okay, so almost always the ending looks like triangles are congruent, and then a pair of angles or segments are congruent. So remember that also if you're using a reason like side, 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 for example, what kind of statement will that justify? Like let's say you're doing like a matching, for example, and you've got side, side, side congruence as one of the options for a reason. What can that justify?
I have no clue.
Okay. Sean, tell me what the step over here would be if the reason was side, side, side. So if you're looking at this, and then you made a statement and said the reason was side, 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 what would the statement be? What kind of statement is justified by side, side, side?
It is congruent.
Say it again.
It's congruent.
What is the it?
The triangles.
Triangles, yes. So that's a fundamental thing you need to understand. Whenever you use side, 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 or side angle side, any of those shortcut ways to prove triangles congruent, you're justifying why the triangles are congruent. So these have to go together. Every time you use like an HL or an angle side angle, whatever that is that you're using, it's always justifying why triangles are congruent. And then your last step on these proofs are going to be, you know, again, there are slight exceptions for that. Like sometimes there might be an additional step, like something about parallel or something, but almost always these proofs go, write down stuff you know about the picture, say why the triangles are congruent, and then say that the what you're trying to prove is true by definition of congruent triangles.